But, for me, Nick, the real problem that we faced with, and I'm not taking a stab at Microsoft. I just want to qualify that. But the real problem that we faced with, and it's a conundrum, right, is, deploying applications. And I actually wrote an article about this, the cursor or the precursor to this session, just 5 things that you should actually know. And some of that I want to talk about today, because I think it's important that everyone understands how these things work. In the old days, someone would say, hey, we've bought this application and we would like these 3 virtual machines, and you drop a web server on top of that and expose port 443. That's it. They deploy the application on top of IIS, and the front end on top of IIS, the application running on a separate server, and it was all about ports. Same with SQL, and people will access the front end on 443, right? HTTPS, TLS, pick a cert type, and Ninja does. Moving to the cloud, very different, right? I've actually had this experience in November, December, where, think about it this way, right? It's literally someone goes in and says, hey, we want to, deploy this Teams app. Great. As a Teams administrator, you go, well, how are you deploying it? Oh, no, we're using the Teams toolkit, hit the deploy button. Teams app now shows up as a custom app in the Teams admin center, and you hit the publish button, right? But when we start looking at these things like single page applications, right, SPA, that little screen that you're looking at right now, I can deploy an application in Entra ID and put no security behind it. And that application that was deployed, that Teams application, was an SPA, but it wasn't serviced out of, a web service account, well, not a web service, an app service plan to include this with. And the crazy thing about that is that URI is optional. So I can build things I can deploy things, I can have other people deploy applications inside of my tenant, and then I sit with the problem around the difference between confidential and public apps, right? Now, you don't have, depending on how you configure your environment, you might not have any control because someone's just going, hey, I want this Teams app, right? And that's not regulated. So this application, my point is the application could end up in your tenant. You know nothing about it, and it's running, and the context of that user is just ridiculously crazy. Now, the difference between doing what we call public apps versus confidential apps, the interface is different. This is actually an enterprise application, and there's zero continuity because there's features that you get when you're deploying an enterprise application that you don't get when you're deploying just a standard, you go to app registration, say new app, and then you need to put things in there. So for me, the important part here is understanding what these applications do in your environment and understanding how they differ depending on the application type, right? A Teams app doesn't mean that it's secure. And that's important to understand because it really depends on how it gets deployed into your tenant. And for the identity and access administrator people, these things live in your world. You now have to worry about it. You go to Entra ID, there's 2 tabs there, application registrations and enterprise applications. It becomes your problem. So Nick, I just want to go through a couple of the things that identity and access administrators, infrastructure people worrying about identity, Active Directory people, security people, developers need to worry about when you start looking at this. So what is it that you actually need to look for, Nick, when we actually walk through various things? And this is by no means in any specific order. These are the things that we've picked up or the things that we've been exposed to over the last probably 2-3 years working with customers around that. Do you want to talk through this?
Please. Yeah, I just want to echo what you said, Al, that identity administrators and application administrators are pointing their fingers at each other. And we've seen that. And someone saying, this is what you should worry about. And they're both saying, no, it's you. No, it's you. And there's no real understanding of what this is actually all about. And I'm going to lean a little bit towards our identity administrators who need to understand about this world. So you'll see in the next few slides, we've picked on a few things. And on the top left-hand side, you can see role assignments. And role assignments.
I clicked forward when you said next slides.
Oh, sorry. No. All right. Okay, let's unpack this a little bit. So role assignments are apps without role assignments. And there's a difference between an app and an enterprise app. We'll talk about that in a second. But in a nutshell, when an app has no role assignment, it means that all the users in the directory, if they're members or guests, can access the application. Now, if you think about that, what application is it? And if the application contains anything sensitive that should be available to specific users and groups, if you haven't created any type of role assignment, that means that all users in the organization and all guests that you invite could potentially see what they're not meant to see. An orphaned application is,
Well,
go on.
We at 8:32, so we are running out of time. So pick two on this slide that we want to talk about. Orphaned apps, if someone leaves your organization and they deployed an application, that person is no longer in charge of that application. It opens up a can of worms.
Let's talk about outdated authentication on the right. We talked about stuff. How did Microsoft get attacked? Think SAML and token theft. And that's so much easier to do in SAML than it is in OAuth 2. For those of us who are old enough to remember what Active Directory is, think NTLM versus Kerberos and token theft. So it means that attackers don't need credentials. Certificates and secrets, huge deals. And consider an attack where a user account is compromised, the attacker gains a secret or a certificate, and then that gives them persistence in Entra ID. So that means they don't need to use a user account or password anymore to continue moving any data out. Next slide. Apps versus enterprise apps. So just in a nutshell, an enterprise app is a third-party app. So someone that you buy from someone else, like an Adobe, that's registered as an enterprise app. And apps are nearly everything else, but there's more to it, right? It's not confusing at all. But consider that an app can potentially read everybody's files, emails, addresses, etc., or can only do the specific things to the user objects that are under the scope of the app that you have R-backed. Now, the last thing I want to pick on here then quickly are privileged accounts. And next to a global admin or an application administrator in this world, which is the next big thing to a global admin, the big deal are specific API permissions. And we saw that with the Microsoft hack. And that means that a user could have read-write permissions globally to objects in Entra ID without being part of a special permissions group. And how would you know?
Yeah, and for me, the app integration one is actually dear to my heart because, you know, we used to do these DevOps conferences, right, where they talk about DevSecOps and site reliability engineering and things like that. So you secure your environment and your application secure, and you've got a web application firewall and all the rules and stuff. But the repo where this application is being published from is not secure. So what ends up happening, the developers writing the code, they get compromised, their identities get compromised. They inject something into an HTML page or an ASPX page that's going to be published to your environment, and you are none the wiser. So it's not only things that's in your environment, it's also things that are attached to your environment, because now you need to have to worry about, you know, any sort of repo where people are building applications for your organization. You have to understand, well, is that secure? Are they injecting anything that side? So it's not only your identities, but the identities that touch your environment that you also need to worry about. Well, look, that's you know, our name's a mouthful, but so is our chicken. Is that the right thing? I can't remember what that was. It was an ad in the old days, right? But I mean, we've gone through 3 hours worth of things to talk about in 35 minutes. So